you'll turn with me to the book of Genesis, to chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. Last time we took a look at Genesis, and we were in Genesis chapter 11. We were examining the Tower of Babel there, and the people gathered together for the purpose of constructing this temple and this tower that reaches up into heaven. And they do this in defiance of God's commands to spread out and to populate the earth. And then that narrative ends in Genesis chapter 11, verse 9, with the Lord confusing their languages, scattering them across the earth. And that very abruptly ends what we sometimes call the primeval history. All the stuff that happens in the first 11 chapters of Genesis that is, it's so long ago that these are pretty much the only records that we have of anything like this, and things are a little bit stranger in these chapters than in some of the other chapters of Genesis, because after this point, it no longer feels like the history of humanity, and it seems to narrow down to just one person. And for the rest of Genesis, it's really going to only follow about one or two people at a time. When Moses is writing this, we have to remember that this is him getting to his point. These chapters are just building up to get to his point. And his point is at the beginning of chapter 12, when he introduces Abraham. Everything is building up to Abraham and the promises that are made to Abraham. And then as we continue through the book after that, we see how those promises are fulfilled through the faithfulness of Abraham and his descendants. And of course, that leads directly into Exodus, at which point in time Moses' first readers are going to start saying, aha, these are things that I remember happening. I was there when that part happened. And so we're kind of building up to the present day from Moses' perspective, okay? But Genesis chapter 11, in verses 10 through 26, we have a kind of a repeated genealogy from chapter 10. It goes a little bit further, but it starts with Shem, and it builds all the way up to a man named Terah. In verse 26, it says, and Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay, we're going to skip over that section because there's as much as I love genealogies, there's not much to do with that one. And I'd much rather look at the next one. So that's what we're going to do instead. I want to look at chapter 11, verse 27. And don't worry, we're not just going to go through verse 32. We're going to break into chapter 12 as well. We start in verse 27, and we read this. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of Terah his father in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. And Sarah was barren, and she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to go to the land of Canaan. And they came as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land and from your kin, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram went forth, as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go forth to the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. And Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. So, what I want to bring out from this, there are a lot of lessons that can be pulled from this text, and I'm probably going to try to milk it as much as possible because there really is a lot here, and I don't want to leave anything unturned. What I want to focus on, especially with this larger section going all the way back into chapter 11, I want to talk about the family relationships that they have with one another, and how those family relationships relate to the faith that they have. Now, one of the main things these genealogies are emphasizing are, of course, these family relationships, but specifically how faith gets passed down. That's one of the big things that these illustrate, is how faith gets passed down. Now, sometimes that happens, and other times it doesn't happen. But we see these relationships, and I want to make a few observations here. First of all, the family structure itself. Now, this is kind of a complicated family, and I tried to sit down and draw out a family tree, and let's just say the branches cross a few times. This would not be considered a normal family in our society today. We don't usually marry our nieces or our cousins. That would be considered very strange. But for them, that was not weird. That was not frowned upon. In fact, it was very common to marry family members. Things have changed a lot. But we notice the patriarch of this particular family is a man named Terah. And Terah has 3 sons. Now, these are not the only children he has. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But he has at least 3 sons that we learn about. We don't know exactly in what order they're born, but what's interesting is that one of the sons, and this would be Haran, one of his sons dies before the other 2. He dies relatively early on. He dies while Terah and his family are still living in Ur. So they're still living all the way in southern Mesopotamia. Okay, they're all the way down here. Now, at a certain point in time, Terah packs up his family, and they move to northern Mesopotamia to a city called Haran. No relation to the name of his son. It's just a confusing coincidence there. They move up to the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia because they're on their way to Canaan. Right? You you go north, and then you come down south into Canaan. That's kind of the direction you would travel. You wouldn't go straight across because there's nothing but desert across. So if you were to go across, you'd die halfway. That's not feasible. So you'd go up north, and then you'd come down south. So that's the route that Abraham and his family take. Now, one of Terah's other sons, whose name is Nahor, he actually marries like I said, I know this is weird. He marries his niece. He marries Milcah, who is his brother's daughter. Well, it isn't stated here, but Abraham tells us later on that his wife is his half-sister. So they share the same father, Terah, and a different mother. So we have Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and then whether, from some other wife, you have Sarai, later becomes Sarah. Okay, so like I said, this is a very, very weird and complicated family. This is definitely not what we would consider an ideal family structure, that's for sure. But I want you to notice this. Abraham, or Abram, as he's known now, Abram does not leave Ur by himself. He does not, we read 12 verses 1 through 3 where it said, the Lord calls to Abram and he calls him to leave his home country. But the calling in chapter 12 is not a calling from the city of Ur. It's actually a calling from the city of Haran. He and his family they've already made it halfway. Terah was on his way to Canaan. Now, at this point, we don't, the information ends. We don't have any more detail. Why is it that Terah was on his way to Canaan? I don't know. I really don't know. I would conclude, and it's just a conclusion, I would conclude that Abram's call was not the first call they had received from God. But Abram is instead the only one to actually follow through. Terah packs up his family. And notice, he's not able to get all his family on board with this. It says that he takes Abram and Sarai, he takes his son and his daughter-in-law, and he takes his orphaned grandson, Lot. Lot, his father, has passed away, and so Terah takes him into his house, and he takes Lot, he takes Abram and Sarai, and he says, we're moving to Haran. And they travel together all the way. This is a long distance. This is they're leaving everything behind, and they travel all the way to Haran, and for some reason they stop there. And the numbers are kind of hard to work out exactly how long they spent in Haran, but they spend quite some time. By the time we get to chapter 12 and we see Abram leaving Haran by himself, he's 75 years old. He's not a young man. He's, even though people did live longer at that time, he's still not young. He's still a pretty old man. And he leaves along with Sarai and Lot and comes into the promised land. Now, why is it that Terah doesn't follow all the way through? Is it because he's old? Maybe, that's possible. But I find it interesting that when he leaves to go to the city of Haran, when he leaves to go to Canaan, his other son, remember he's got 3 sons. One is dead, one comes with him, and one stays behind in Mesopotamia. I find it interesting that Nahor stays behind, but Terah still leaves. He doesn't let his children keep him from following through. At least taking a step in the right direction. But at the same time, he doesn't follow all the way through. He goes to Haran and then he stops. He never actually comes into the land of Canaan. And maybe the reason why this stands out to me so much is because of how often I see this play out today. That parents are hindered by their own children. That they start to lose their faithfulness because their children aren't as faithful as they should be. And instead of following the Lord wholeheartedly, they still want to keep a foot back. Terah wants to go into Canaan, and he does. I mean, he takes steps in that direction. It seems like he's doing what he should do, but he doesn't go all the way. He doesn't fully commit. And it's like he's trying to keep one foot in Mesopotamia. Trying to still hold on at least a little bit. And by contrast, look what Abram does. He is not afraid to move past his own parents' faith. These are the two family anchors that have the potential to cause the most damage. Your children and your parents. And Abram doesn't let his father hold him back. He doesn't look at his father's hesitance as an excuse for him. I'm just sticking with my father. I'm just going to do what he does. What would I be saying about my father if I'm the one if I do this? What is that going to imply about him? He doesn't ask any questions like that. In Galatians 3, verses 6 through 9, Paul says, just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, so know that those who are of faith, those are sons of Abraham. And that the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, proclaimed the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. We don't read about Terah the believer. We don't refer to Terah as the father of the faithful. Why? Because his faith was reluctant. His faith was half-hearted. It wasn't committed. Imagine if Abraham's faith was confined to that his father had. Instead, he was called, chapter 12, verse 1, to go forth from his land, to go forth from his kin, to go forth from his father's house. And what do we read in verse 4? So Abram, I keep trying to say Abraham. He's not Abraham yet. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. He leaves. He doesn't stick with his family. He shifts his priority away from his family, away from the people who have raised him, away from the family connections he has, and fully commits to the Lord. In Matthew 10, 34 through 39, Jesus said, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, Jesus uses a lot of hyperbolic language, a lot of extreme statements sometimes. I want you to listen to the point he's making. For I came to set a man against his father. Think about the relationship between Abram and Terah. And a daughter against her mother. And a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me, in other words, if you love your own life more than Jesus, is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it. And he who has lost his life for my sake will find it. I think very easily we see Christianity as an element of our lives. If our life is a puzzle, maybe a puzzle for kids, because they've got fewer pieces, right? Maybe there's like 6 pieces in this puzzle. One piece, it's a pretty big piece. One piece is family. One piece is our career. Another piece is our hobbies. Another piece is I don't know, something else you like to do. Another part is your role in the community. Another part is church. I think we see Christianity that way sometimes. It's just another piece among the pieces. It's another part of our life among the parts of our life. But Jesus doesn't describe commitment that way. Abram doesn't view his life that way. Imagine if Abram saw his life that way, where, it was just another factor in his decision making. Well, God did call me, but I've got so many things to consider. I've got to take care of my wife. I've got a lot to take care of. I don't even have any of my own children. I've got to figure that out. I have no idea how. I don't know what the culture is like in this, but I can't move. I don't know the language. My father's here. I've got to take care of my father. There's all sorts of objections and excuses that Abraham could have made, but instead we see his focus. He buckles down and just focuses on the Lord. He went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. It isn't really clear whether when he leaves his father is still living or not. It's a little bit hard to tell from the text. But his only question is, what does the Lord ask of me? What is it that God expects for me to do? Now, obviously today God isn't going to call you out in the same way. He's not going to call you out from your father and your kindred to go to a land that he's going to show you. And if you just move to Zimbabwe, then he's going to bless you. That's not going to happen. The call that God has provided to all of us is the call of the gospel. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus describes in the parable of the wedding feast, it says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and he sent out his slaves to call those who had been called to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. And when Jesus is telling us, he talks about those who had been called, he's talking about the Jewish people at that time. But they were unwilling to come, and he sent out other slaves, saying, tell those who've been called, behold, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything's ready. Come to the wedding feast. So this kind of represents the prophets. Hey, let them know. Change their ways. Come into the kingdom. But they paid no attention, went on their way. One to his own farm, another to his business. And you see where their priorities are. The rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Those who didn't just ignore the prophets, murdered the prophets. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were called were not worthy. Go therefore into the main highways and find as many as you find there, called to the wedding feast. And those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. This call to the wedding feast, this call of the gospel into the kingdom, it's not limited to a small number of people. It is opened up for everyone. This call is open and broad, and anyone can answer it. Now, the call we read about in Genesis 12 is limited. The call that Terah may have received was limited. God wasn't just calling everybody to come to Canaan and, whoever did it first was going to win the golden prize. This isn't some kind of contest that God puts on. He personally selects Abram and his family. But that isn't the case anymore. That isn't how the gospel works. It's open to everyone, if we're willing to respond in the same way that Abram is, to follow him wholeheartedly. And we read that Abram did. That he went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and I want you to notice a phrase in verse 8. It says, he proceeded from there, Shechem, to the mountain on the east of Bethel. And he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Now, this phrase here, called upon the name of the Lord, this is a very interesting phrase. It's used in several different places throughout Scripture. And it's been used in Genesis one time already. And that's back in chapter 4, verse 26. In chapter 4, we read of Cain and Abel, and then it gives Cain's genealogy. And at the end, talks about the birth of Seth. In Genesis 4, verse 26, we read, and to Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Seth is like this like prototype, or the epitome of the righteous line. Seth's descendants are going to lead to Noah. Noah's descendants are going to lead to Abram. And the way Moses writes this, he's describing for us that the righteousness that Abram takes on, he rejects everything around him. He decides not to live like anyone else and to call on the name of the Lord. In the same way that his forefathers did. His role model isn't his dad. His role model isn't the people around him. His role model isn't the people back in Ur. His role model are the righteous forefathers he has. And I don't know how much he knew about them, but that's the kind of life he lives. He looks to these righteous examples and role models to teach him how to live. And notice this as well. In verse 5 of chapter 12, so Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son. Why does he bring Lot? I don't know exactly why he brings Lot, and Lot doesn't stay with his grandfather and Haran. I don't know. Maybe Terah has already passed away. I have no idea. But look at what Abram does. He brings him along. And, Lot is a very interesting fellow. He has some very questionable decisions that he makes along the way. He makes some really poor decisions. But he is a relative of Abram. And Abram works on him as much as he can. He cares for him. He invests in him. He takes care of him. And he provides an example of faithfulness. Now, not everyone in our family is interested in serving God. Not everyone in our family is interested in being dedicated. Not everyone really wants to give it their all. But Abram is committed to bringing along whoever he can. And he does his best. even though Lot isn't his son. When I was reading through this, I thought, well, maybe he's adopted Lot. Maybe it's that kind of relationship. But he really hasn't. You read later on when God comes to him and tells him that God has another conversation with him. Abram brings up, I don't have an heir. In other words, he hasn't really adopted Lot. Because if he'd adopted Lot, then Lot would be his heir. But he hasn't done that. He's just taking care of him and leading him because he cares about the man. In James 5, verses 19 through 20, James encourages us, my brothers, if any among you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. God wants for us to help each other. He wants for us to bring each other along, to build each other up, and provide an example and encouragement when we need it. Abram was far from perfect. His family was far from perfect. But one thing Abram was, he was faithful. He was committed. Sometimes he stumbled, sometimes he faltered, sometimes he sinned, but he didn't let that stop him. He didn't let his family stop him. He didn't let the people who were around him stop him. He didn't let his own fears and insecurities and sins stop him. He was focused on only one thing, and that is what the Lord had told him to do. I pray that we will have that kind of commitment as well. If you need any prayers, or if you need to make anything known, please come while we stand and sing.
Shall we gather at the river, where